The coral reef at Tarawa Atoll stretched 500 yards from the beach like the Earth's exposed skeleton, its jagged spine breaking the surface at low tide on November 20, 1943, at 0842 hours when the first wave of Higgins boats ground to a halt in 3 feet of water. Private First Class William Deane Hawkins of the 2nd Marine Division, Scout Sniper Platoon, stood in LCVP No. 7 and saw what every Marine in the first wave saw simultaneously. They were trapped 500 yards from Red Beach 1 on Betio Island, and the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces were waiting. The reef wasn't supposed to be there. Intelligence reports had promised 5 feet of water over the coral at high tide, enough for the flat-bottomed Higgins boats to scrape across and deliver the 2nd Marine Division directly onto the beach. The Navy's tide tables, calculated from observations at similar atolls, indicated 1,000 hours would bring the highest water. But Tarawa Atoll didn't follow the rules. The neap tide on November 20th left the reef exposed like a barrier of fossilized bone, and Major David Shoup's 2nd Marines, 2nd Marine Division, were about to discover that the 500 yards between the reef and the beach would become the most expensive real estate in Marine Corps history, measured at 1 casualty per yard. Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had commanded the Tarawa garrison for 15 months, turning Betio Island into what he called, "a million men cannot take in 100 years." The island measured only 2 miles long and 800 yards at its widest point, roughly the size of Central Park, but Shibazaki had packed it with 500 pillboxes, 40 artillery pieces, and 4,500 men from the 3rd Special Base Defense Force and the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force. He'd studied the reef for over a year, knew its every contour, understood that any American landing force would have to cross it at low tide eventually. His men had pre-registered their weapons on the reef, calculating ranges, angles, trajectories. They'd even conducted live-fire exercises, shooting at floating targets pushed across the coral to simulate landing craft. When Shibazaki saw the Higgins boats grinding onto the reef that morning, he reportedly told his operations officer, Commander Takeo Sugai, "The Americans have delivered themselves to us. They will feed the fish." The LVT's landing vehicle tract, also called Amtraks or alligators, were the only hope. These were essentially floating tanks without armor, steel boxes with tracks that could crawl over the reef and swim through the lagoon. The 2nd Marine Division had 125 of them, enough to carry the first 3 waves. Private Robert Sherrod, a Time magazine correspondent attached to the 2nd Marines, rode in LVT No. 10, watching the reef approach through the vehicle's open top. He wrote in his notebook, water-stained but still readable, 0843 Higgins boats stuck on reef. Marines jumping out. Machine gun fire from shore. Water turns pink around boats.
0844 Jesus Christ.
The Japanese had positioned Type 92 heavy machine guns in concrete pillboxes along the seawall, each gun capable of firing 450 rounds per minute of 77mm ammunition. These weren't random bursts but disciplined, interlocking fields of fire that Shibazaki's men had practiced for months. Gunners mate 2nd Class Tadao Onuki of the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force manned position No. 14 on Red Beach 2. His field of fire covered a 200-yard section of reef. In his diary, recovered after the battle, he wrote, "The Americans walk through our bullets like they don't see them. They fall, others keep walking. They carry their wounded on their backs. Some swim pulling bodies. I have never seen such determination. I have never created such slaughter." Lance Corporal Kenneth Sellers of F Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, jumped from his Higgins boat at 0847 hours into chest-deep water. The boat had struck the reef so hard that its hull plates buckled, water pouring through the seams. Sellers carried an M1 Garand rifle, 80 rounds of ammunition, 2 days' rations, a first aid kit, and an entrenching tool. The weight, 68 pounds total, pulled him under immediately. He dropped the entrenching tool, let his pack float away, kept the rifle and ammunition. The man next to him, Private Eugene Turchson from Iowa, age 19, took 3 steps before machine gun fire stitched across his chest. He fell backward, tried to speak, blood bubbling from his mouth instead of words. Sellers grabbed him, tried to pull him forward, but Turchson was already dead, his body weight doubled by water-soaked gear. Sellers let him go, watched him sink, kept walking toward the beach that seemed to recede with each step. The water depth varied across the reef. In some places, it was knee-deep, offering minimal cover. In others, shell holes from the preliminary bombardment created pools 6 feet deep where Marines could take temporary shelter. But these pools became death traps when Japanese mortars found them, the confined space multiplying the shrapnel effect. A single 70mm mortar round landing in a pool could kill or wound a dozen men. The water turned red, then pink, then red again as more bodies bled out. By 0900 hours, 15 minutes after the first wave hit the reef, hundreds of Marines were down, floating face down in the lagoon or draped over coral heads like discarded uniforms. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault troops, rode in an LVT that made it over the reef but was hit by 37mm anti-boat gunfire 50 yards from the beach. The shell punched through the thin armor, decapitated his radio operator, wounded Shoup in the leg with shrapnel. He jumped into waist-deep water, waded ashore under fire, established his command post behind a Japanese Type 95 light tank that had been knocked out by naval gunfire. From this position, crouched behind 3 tons of burned steel, he would direct the battle for the next 3 days. His first message to the fleet: issue in doubt. The LVTs that made it to the beach discharged their Marines directly into hell. Red Beach 1 was only 500 yards long, backed by a coconut log seawall 4 feet high. Behind the seawall, the Japanese had constructed an interlocking defense system that would become the template for every island battle to follow. Pillboxes made from reinforced concrete, walls 3 feet thick, covered by coconut logs and sand. Each pillbox supported others with overlapping fire. Underground tunnels connected positions, allowing defenders to shift quickly. Every approach was covered. Every dead space had been eliminated through careful engineering. The Marines who made it over the seawall found themselves in prearranged kill zones, taking fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, who would earn fame at Guadalcanal and die at Iwo Jima, was supposed to be in the States selling war bonds, but had volunteered to return to combat. He led a machine gun section from H Company, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines across the reef under heavy fire. Of his 12-man section, 5 made it to the beach. They set up their water-cooled Browning M1917 behind the seawall, began returning fire at Japanese positions. The gun's water jacket boiled after 200 rounds of sustained fire. They urinated into it to keep it cool, kept firing. When that wasn't enough, they used seawater, which corroded the mechanism but kept the gun running for another hour. Basilone would later say that Tarawa was worse than anything at Guadalcanal because at least in the jungle you could find cover. On Betio, there was nowhere to hide. The second wave hit the reef at 0910 hours, finding it littered with bodies and equipment from the first wave. These Marines could see what awaited them: the floating corpses, the burning LVTs, the wounded men calling for help from the lagoon. But they jumped from their Higgins boats anyway, began the 500-yard walk through water that varied from knee-deep to neck-deep, through machine gun fire that never stopped, mortar rounds that walked across the reef in systematic patterns. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon of San Antonio, Texas, an engineer with the 1st Battalion, 18th Marines, made 4 trips across the reef, each time carrying wounded men on his back, each time returning for more. On his 5th trip, machine gun fire caught him 20 yards from the beach. He crawled the remaining distance, bleeding from 6 wounds, used his last strength to push a wounded Marine over the seawall, then died with his hands still on the man's shoulders. Admiral Shibazaki watched the slaughter from his command bunker near the airfield, the highest point on Betio Island at 12 feet above sea level. He could see the entire reef through his observation periscope, watch individual Marines struggling through the water, see them fall when his machine gunners found them. He told his staff that the Americans were insane to continue the attack, that any sensible enemy would withdraw and try another landing site. But they kept coming, wave after wave, climbing over their own dead, using floating corpses as shields, pushing forward with a determination he found both admirable and incomprehensible. At 0930 hours, he ordered all reserves committed to the beach defenses. There would be no withdrawal, no fallback positions. The battle would be decided at the water's edge. Private First Class Albert Gilman of the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion drove LVT number 45, making 6 trips from the transport ships to the beach. Each trip, he carried 20 Marines and returned with wounded. By his 4th trip, the LVT's armor was perforated with over 100 holes from small arms fire. Sea water sloshed through the holes, mixing with blood from wounded Marines. The engine, a Continental W670 radial aircraft engine, overheated constantly from the strain of climbing over the reef. Gilman drove with one hand, poured canteen water on the engine with the other. On his 5th trip, a 37mm shell destroyed the left track. He drove the last 100 yards to the beach on one track, spinning in circles, still taking fire, finally ramming the seawall at full throttle. The impact threw him clear. When he looked back, his LVT was burning, ammunition cooking off, but the Marines he'd carried were over the seawall and advancing inland. The Japanese 77mm Type 92 heavy machine guns were water-cooled, capable of sustained fire for hours. Each gun crew had trained for months on Betio, memorizing range cards, practicing barrel changes, learning to maintain a steady rate of fire that wouldn't overheat the mechanism. Corporal Yoshio Yamada commanded gun position number 7 covering Red Beach 2. His ammunition bearer, Private Kenzo Watanabe, fed belt after belt into the gun, counting rounds, calling out when barrel changes were needed. They'd stacked 4,000 rounds in their pillbox, enough for 8 minutes of continuous fire. By 1,000 hours, they'd gone through half their ammunition. The water in the cooling jacket was boiling, steam venting through the overflow valve. Watanabe's hands were burned from handling hot brass casings. But they kept firing, sweeping the reef in measured arcs, watching Marines fall like wheat before a scythe. Major Michael Ryan's L Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, landed on Red Beach 1 at 1,005 hours, the 3rd wave to hit the reef. Ryan, 31 years old, from Detroit, had fought at Guadalcanal, knew what combat looked like, but Tarawa was different. At Guadalcanal, you could maneuver, find cover, flank enemy positions. Here, there was only forward or dead. His company had 240 men when they left the transport ships. By the time they reached the beach, he had 150 effectives. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing in the lagoon. Ryan gathered his survivors behind the seawall, organized them into assault teams, began attacking pillboxes with grenades and flamethrowers. It took an average of 40 minutes to reduce each pillbox, and there were dozens visible from his position alone. The flamethrowers were M1A1 models, carrying 4 gallons of napalm-thickened gasoline. Effective range 65 feet. Burn time 9 seconds. Private Robert Miller, flamethrower operator with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, had trained with the weapon at Camp Pendleton but never used it in combat. His first target was a pillbox on Red Beach 2 that had killed a dozen Marines in 5 minutes. Miller crawled forward, dragging the 70-pound flamethrower, while his assistant gunner, Private Tony Martinez, provided covering fire. At 20 feet from the pillbox aperture, Miller triggered the igniter. The flame jet hit the opening, rolled inside like liquid fire. The screaming started immediately. 3 Japanese soldiers ran out burning, their uniforms fused to their skin. Martinez shot them, mercy killings. The pillbox was cleared, but Miller vomited from the smell of burned flesh, couldn't eat for 3 days afterward. By 10:30 hours, the beach was a charnel house. Bodies stacked behind the seawall like cordwood. Wounded men lying in rows, medics doing triage with brutal efficiency. Those who might survive got morphine and sulfa powder. Those who wouldn't got a prayer and were left to die. The sand was no longer white but dark brown, soaked with blood and oil from burning vehicles. 23 LVTs burned on the beach or in the shallow water, their crews dead inside, cooked by their own burning fuel. The smell, burning flesh, cordite, diesel fuel, rotting fish killed by the bombardment was overwhelming. Marines vomited from the stench, fought while dry heaving, their bodies rejecting the sensory overload of industrial death. Lieutenant William Deane Hawkins, the same Marine who'd stood in LCVP No. 7 when it hit the reef, led Scout Sniper Platoon in clearing Japanese positions along the airfield. Hawkins was 29, from Texas, had a reputation for aggressive tactics that bordered on suicidal. He attacked pillboxes by himself, crawling close enough to throw grenades through the apertures, shooting defenders as they fled. His platoon cleared 12 positions in 2 hours, Hawkins personally accounting for 6. At 1,130 hours attacking a command bunker near the airfield, he was hit by machine gun fire, 3 bullets in the chest. He stayed conscious long enough to throw a satchel charge into the bunker, waited for the explosion, counted the secondary explosions from ammunition inside, then died smiling. He'd be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, one of 4 earned on Betio. The Japanese communication system, built on buried cables and field telephones, allowed Admiral Shibazaki to maintain control despite the bombardment. He received reports from each sector, adjusted fire plans, shifted reserves. His defense was working exactly as planned. The Americans were dying at the predicted rate, their attack stalling at the seawall. But he hadn't anticipated their persistence. Military doctrine suggested that 30% casualties would break any attacking force. The Americans had already exceeded that and kept coming. At 1,145 hours, he received a report that disturbed him. Marines had captured a section of the pier on Red Beach 2 and were using it to land supplies directly, bypassing the reef. He ordered a counterattack to retake the pier, committing his last reserve company. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., an engineer officer with the 8th Marines, led the assault on the largest Japanese position on Betio, a reinforced concrete blockhouse that served as Admiral Shibazaki's headquarters. The structure was 40 feet by 60 feet, walls 4 feet thick, covered with sand and coconut logs. It had survived direct hits from 14-inch naval shells. Bonnyman organized an assault team of engineers and infantry, attacked at 1,200 hours on November 20th. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the surrounding obstacles, flamethrowers to clear the entrances, satchel charges to destroy the structure. Bonnyman was first over the top, firing a carbine with one hand, throwing grenades with the other. A Japanese officer emerged from a tunnel, shot Bonnyman 3 times in the stomach. Bonnyman killed him with his last magazine, stayed on his feet long enough to wave his men forward, then collapsed. The position was taken, but Bonnyman died watching the American flag raised over the ruins. Another Medal of Honor posthumous. The tide tables had been wrong about many things, but they were right about one. The tide would start rising at 1,300 hours. Not much, maybe 18 inches, but enough for some Higgins boats to scrape over the reef. The 4th and 5th waves, held offshore since morning, finally started landing. But the rising tide brought its own horror. Bodies that had sunk in the morning floated to the surface, hundreds of them, Marines and Japanese mixed together, bloated from the heat, some missing limbs taken by sharks that had been drawn by the blood. Landing craft had to push through floating corpses to reach the beach. One coxswain, Seaman First Class Robert Perry, counted 43 bodies his boat pushed aside in the final 50 yards to shore. Corporal James Russell of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, was part of the 5th wave, landing at 1,330 hours. His first sight of Betio was a Marine crucified on the beach obstacles, hung on the crossed timbers by his own intestines, still alive, calling for his mother. Russell's squad leader, Sergeant Paul Henderson, shot the man in the head, an act of mercy that would haunt Henderson for the rest of his life. Russell stepped over the body, moved inland, found himself in a coconut grove that had been turned into a moonscape by naval bombardment. The trees were shattered stumps, the ground cratered, Japanese positions hidden in the devastation. His squad of 12 men took 4 hours to advance 100 yards, lost 7 men, killed 23 Japanese defenders. The math was simple and terrible. At this rate, the Marine Corps would run out of men before the Japanese ran out of island. The Sherman tanks started landing at 1,400 hours, M4A2 models with 75mm guns, diesel engines, 30 tons of armor. The Navy had modified special landing craft, LCMs, landing craft mechanized, to carry them. The first tank, China Gal, commanded by Staff Sergeant Roy King, made it 20 yards inland before a Japanese Type 97 anti-tank rifle, firing a 20mm round, penetrated the driver's vision slit. The driver, Corporal Eugene Barnett, was decapitated. The tank went wild, crushing Marines in foxholes, running over wounded men, before King could stop it. They drove the rest of the battle with Barnett's body still in the driver's seat, King reaching around the corpse to steer. By nightfall, only 2 of the 14 tanks that landed were still operational. Admiral Shibazaki's command bunker took a direct hit from naval gunfire at 1,430 hours. The shell, probably from the battleship USS Maryland's 16-inch guns, penetrated the concrete roof, detonated inside. Shibazaki and his entire staff, 12 officers and 18 enlisted men, were killed instantly. The explosion was so powerful it blew a hole through the floor into the ammunition storage below, setting off a chain reaction that destroyed the entire complex. Marines 500 yards away felt the ground shake. A pillar of smoke rose 300 feet. With Shibazaki dead, Japanese command and control collapsed. Individual units continued fighting, but coordination ended. The defense became a series of isolated strongpoints, each fighting its own battle. Pharmacist's mate 2nd Class William Thompson, a Navy corpsman attached to the 2nd Marines, treated over 40 wounded Marines on Red Beach 2 before being killed. He worked in the open, no cover, Japanese snipers specifically targeting him because killing a medic demoralized the Marines. Thompson knew he was marked but kept working. He used his own body to shield wounded men while treating them. When he ran out of medical supplies, he collected bandages from the dead, washed them in seawater, reused them. At 1,500 hours, while treating a Marine with a sucking chest wound, a sniper's bullet hit Thompson in the head. He fell across the wounded Marine, his body providing cover long enough for others to drag the man to safety. Thompson's last act was to hand his medical kit to another Marine, saying, "You're the doc now." Private First Class Fred Harvey of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, landed in the 6th wave at 1,530 hours. The beach was so crowded with dead and wounded that his squad had to walk on bodies to move inland. Harvey stepped on what he thought was a dead Japanese soldier. The man was alive, grabbed Harvey's ankle, tried to pull a grenade pin with his teeth. Harvey shot him point-blank with his M1 Garand, the 30-06 round blowing the man's head apart, spraying brain matter across Harvey's boots. He scraped it off with his bayonet, kept moving. 20 yards later, he stepped on another body. This one was a Marine, still alive, both legs blown off at the knees. The Marine grabbed Harvey's hand, said, "Tell my mother I wasn't scared," Harvey promised. Asked the man's name. "Johnson, Robert Johnson." From Ohio. Harvey never found out if there was a Robert Johnson from Ohio. There were 17 Johnsons killed at Tarawa. The pier on Red Beach 2 became the lifeline for the invasion. It extended 500 yards from shore, built on coconut log pilings, wide enough for vehicles. The Japanese had left it intact, planning to use it for their own counterattack that never came. Marines could walk along it, avoiding the killing zone of the reef. But Japanese machine gunners had it zeroed, fired bursts every few minutes, forcing men to sprint between pilings. Corporal Louis Michelini ran the pier 17 times on November 20th, carrying ammunition forward, wounded back. He calculated the Japanese firing pattern, timed his runs between bursts. On his 18th run, the pattern changed. Machine gun fire caught him halfway, cut him in half at the waist. His legs kept running for 3 more steps before falling. By 1,600 hours, Marines held a beachhead 200 yards deep in some places, still measured in feet in others. They'd captured the west end of the airfield, the main objective, but couldn't use it. Japanese positions on the south side brought any movement on the runway under direct fire. The airfield was littered with destroyed Japanese aircraft, Mitsubishi G4M bombers and Aichi E-13A floatplanes caught by the pre-invasion bombardment. Marines used the wrecked planes for cover, fighting from inside burned fuselages, firing through empty engine cowlings. One Marine, Private David Spencer, set up a .30 caliber machine gun in the tail gunner position of a destroyed bomber, used the aircraft's armored seat for protection, held off a Japanese counterattack for 2 hours from inside the wreckage. The Japanese counterattack came at 1,700 hours, not the massive banzai charge Americans expected, but a coordinated assault using fire and maneuver. 2 companies of Special Naval Landing Forces, about 300 men, attacked along the boundary between Red Beach 2 and Red Beach 3. They used smoke grenades to screen their advance, moved in short rushes, covering each other with rifle and machine gun fire. This was not the suicidal charging of popular imagination but professional infantry tactics. They penetrated the Marine lines, got among the artillery positions, fierce hand-to-hand fighting in the fading light. Gunners lowered their 75mm pack howitzers to zero elevation, fired canister rounds point-blank into Japanese infantry. 1 gun crew, surrounded, fired their last canister round, then fought with ramrods and shell casings until overrun. Master Gunnery Sergeant Edward Carlson, at 41 the oldest Marine in the assault waves, organized the defense against the counterattack. He gathered cooks, clerks, wounded men who could still hold rifles, formed them into a firing line. When Japanese soldiers broke through, Carlson met them with a Thompson submachine gun in each hand, fired both simultaneously, the muzzle flashes lighting his face like a demon from hell. He killed 11 Japanese soldiers in 90 seconds, the Thompson so hot the wooden foregrips were smoking. When he ran out of ammunition, he used the weapons as clubs, broke one over a Japanese soldier's helmet, killed the man with the jagged stock. Carlson survived Tarawa, would die of a heart attack in 1947, his family said brought on by what he'd seen and done on Betio. Night fell at 18:15 hours, bringing temporary relief from the snipers but introducing new terrors. Japanese infiltrators moved through the darkness, crawling into Marine positions, killing with knives and grenades. Password challenges, lollipop with the response sucker, meant nothing when Japanese soldiers who spoke English answered correctly. Marines learned to ask questions only Americans would know. Who won the 1941 World Series? What's the capital of Texas? One Japanese soldier, speaking perfect English, tried to bluff his way past a checkpoint. A Marine asked him, "What's a Chicago hot dog?" The Japanese soldier hesitated. Guessed, "A sausage?" The Marine shot him. The correct answer was, "With everything." The wounded lay where they fell, thousands of them, American and Japanese mixed together in the darkness. Water was critically short. The invasion force had expected to capture the Japanese cisterns intact, but bombardment had destroyed them. Marines drank from canteens taken from dead Japanese, risking disease but desperate for moisture in the 100-degree heat. Some men drank seawater mixed with iodine tablets, which caused violent diarrhea, further dehydrating them. Others sucked moisture from cut vegetation, risking poisoning from unknown plants. Corpsman Stanley Wisniewski treated dehydration by giving men 4 drips of plasma, the only fluid available, knowing it was meant for blood loss but having no choice. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, brought his reserve battalion ashore at 2,000 hours, wading through floating bodies in the darkness. His orders were to prepare for a Japanese counterattack expected at dawn. Murray positioned his men in a secondary line behind the assault troops, using destroyed Japanese positions as fighting holes. They spent the night improving positions, filling sandbags with coral sand, setting up interlocking fields of fire. At 2,300 hours, infiltrators attacked his command post. Murray shot 2 with his pistol. His operations officer killed another with an entrenching tool. They found a 4th hiding under a pile of American dead, playing corpse. When they pulled him out, he triggered a grenade, killing himself and wounding 3 Marines. Private Jack Lewis, 18 years old, from Kansas, spent his first night on Betio in a shell hole with 3 dead Marines and a dying Japanese soldier. The Japanese soldier had been shot through both lungs, breathing in bubbles of blood, but still alive. Lewis considered shooting him but couldn't bring himself to execute a helpless man. He shared his water with the enemy soldier, held his hand as he died. Took 6 hours. The Japanese soldier spoke some English, told Lewis his name was Hideki, that he had a daughter in Nagasaki. He showed Lewis a photograph, a little girl in a kimono. Lewis kept the photograph, returned it to the girl in 1967 when he visited Japan. She was a grandmother by then, wept when she saw her father's picture, thanked Lewis for his kindness. Dawn on November 21st revealed the extent of the carnage. Bodies carpeted the beach, stacked in the lagoon, draped over obstacles. The reef was littered with destroyed landing craft, 23 LVTs, 16 Higgins boats, the wreckage creating an obstacle course for new waves trying to land. Bulldozers brought ashore during the night, dug mass graves behind the beach, pushing bodies in with their blades, no time for identification or proper burial. The operators wore gas masks against the smell, changed them every hour when filters clogged with coral dust and decomposition. One bulldozer operator, Sergeant Carl Matthews, pushed 500 bodies into a trench, then broke down crying, had to be relieved. He never operated heavy equipment again after the war. The second day's fighting focused on reducing Japanese strong points systematically. Engineers with demolition charges, infantry with flamethrowers, tanks with 75mm guns, coordinated attacks on each position. The standard tactic: tanks fired to suppress the position, engineers blew holes in the walls, flamethrower operators burned out the defenders, infantry cleared the ruins. Each pillbox took hours to reduce cost casualties, but the method worked. By noon on November 21st, Marines controlled 2/3 of the island. But the last third would be the hardest, where the Japanese had concentrated their strongest defenses. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone led an assault on a Japanese blockhouse that had resisted 3 previous attacks. The position, designated Target 127 on Marine maps, commanded the eastern approach to the airfield. Basilone organized a composite team from scattered units, led them in a flanking maneuver through a destroyed coconut grove. They attacked from an unexpected direction, Basilone personally destroying 2 machine gun positions with grenades. Inside the blockhouse, they found 42 Japanese bodies and 1 survivor, a 17-year-old conscript who'd hidden under corpses. The boy was crying, begging not to be killed. Basilone gave him water, sent him to the rear for interrogation. The boy would survive the war, become a Buddhist monk, spend his life praying for the dead of both sides. The Sherman tank Colorado, commanded by Lieutenant Louis Largy, became famous on the second day for destroying 14 Japanese positions. Largy used a tactic called corkscrew and blowtorch. The tank would approach a pillbox, fire white phosphorus rounds to blind the defenders, then high explosive to crack the concrete, finally armor-piercing to penetrate and kill. The tank took over 50 hits from anti-tank rifles, the armor scarred and pitted but holding. Inside, the temperature reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew, stripped to their waists, poured canteen water over themselves, kept fighting. The loader, Private Angelo Rossi, passed out from heat exhaustion, was revived with morphine from the medical kit, kept loading shells while semi-conscious. Major William Jones, commanding the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, led the assault on the eastern end of Betio on November 21st. This area, called the Pocket by Marines, contained the strongest Japanese defenses, mutually supporting pillboxes, underground bunkers, concealed anti-tank guns. Jones attacked with 2 companies, about 300 men. 6 hours later, he had 75 men still standing. They'd advanced 300 yards, destroyed 22 enemy positions, killed an estimated 200 Japanese. Jones himself was wounded 3 times, refused evacuation, continued leading from the front until a sniper's bullet shattered his shoulder. As medics carried him away, he told his executive officer, "Don't stop. If you stop, they'll counterattack. Keep pushing, no matter the cost." The Japanese fought with increasing desperation as their perimeter shrank. Wounded Japanese soldiers turned themselves into human bombs, strapping explosives to their bodies, waiting for Marines to approach, detonating themselves. One Marine, Corporal Anthony D'Amato, was checking bodies for intelligence documents when a corpse grabbed him, pulled the pin on a grenade. D'Amato couldn't break free. Both men died in the explosion. After that, Marines shot every Japanese body in the head before approaching, killed wounded enemies who might have survived, took no chances. The battlefield mercy that sometimes existed in Europe never developed in the Pacific. Each side saw the other as less than human, acted accordingly. By evening of November 21st, the 6th Marines had landed their entire regiment, bringing American strength on Betio to about 7,000 men. But casualties were so heavy that effective strength was much lower. Companies that should have had 240 men were fighting with 60 or 70. Platoons were commanded by corporals, companies by lieutenants, battalions by captains. The command structure had been decimated, leaders killed or wounded at a rate that would have collapsed most military organizations. But the Marines held together through NCO leadership and sheer determination to finish what they'd started. That night, the Japanese launched their last major counterattack. 300 survivors of various units, led by Lieutenant Commander Takamura, attacked Marine positions near the airfield. They came in 3 waves, 15 minutes apart, using the last of their grenades and ammunition. Marines met them with everything available: rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery firing over open sights. The killing was mechanical, efficient, without emotion. Marines fired until their weapons overheated, grabbed replacements from dead comrades, kept firing. When the attack ended at 0200 hours on November 22nd, 263 Japanese bodies were counted in front of Marine positions. 7 Marines were killed, 25 wounded. The third day, November 22nd, was cleanup. Isolated Japanese positions still resisted, snipers still killed unwary Marines, but organized resistance had ended. Marines used loudspeakers to call for surrender in Japanese, promising good treatment. 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered out of 4,500 defenders. The rest died fighting or killed themselves. Many Japanese soldiers saved their last bullet for suicide rather than face capture. Marines found groups of Japanese soldiers who'd killed each other, sitting in circles, shot through the head by comrades who then shot themselves. In one bunker, they found 32 bodies, all dead from a single grenade detonated in the center of the group, a mass suicide pact. The most horrible discovery came in an underground bunker near the eastern tip of Betio. Marines using flamethrowers had sealed the entrances, burning out what they thought was a machine gun position. When engineers blew open the bunker 2 days later, they found 120 Korean laborers, conscripted by the Japanese for construction work, all dead from suffocation and burns. They'd been locked inside by Japanese guards, abandoned to die. Among them were 3 American prisoners, Marines captured on the first day, tortured, eyes gouged out, tongues cut off, still alive when the flamethrowers hit. One had scratched a message on the bunker wall: "Tell Mom I died game." PFC Robert Turner, Chicago Turner's mother, would receive the message in 1944, carried by a chaplain who'd copied it from the wall. Colonel David Shoup's final message to V Amphibious Corps on November 22nd read, "Betio secured. Heavy casualties. Estimated 3,000 Marine casualties. 4,500 Japanese dead. 17 prisoners. Island is one continuous cemetery. Request immediate burial details and graves registration. The actual count would be worse. 1,027 Marines killed. 2,292 wounded. 88 missing. Japanese losses: 4,690 killed. 17 wounded prisoners. 129 Korean laborers survived. The mathematics were stark: 1 Marine casualty for every 3 yards of island captured, 1 death for every 6 yards advanced. The burial details worked for a week. Marines and Seabees dug trenches with bulldozers, laid bodies in rows, covered them with coral sand. Identification was often impossible. Bodies recovered from the water were bloated beyond recognition. Tattoos expanded to illegibility, fingerprints gone. Dog tags had been blown off by explosions, melted by flamethrowers, lost in the reef. Graves registration tried to identify bodies by dental work, scars, personal effects, but hundreds would remain unknown. They were buried as unknown Marine, died Tarawa, November 1943. Families would never know exactly where their sons died, only that they were somewhere in the coral sand of Betio. The Marines found Admiral Shibazaki's body in the ruins of his command bunker. Identified by his rank insignia and samurai sword, he was buried with military honors. The only Japanese officer accorded that respect. Colonel Shoup insisted on it, over objections from his staff. "He fought well," Shoup said. "He deserves recognition, even as an enemy Shibazaki's sword was sent to the Naval Academy Museum. His personal effects to his family in Japan after the war." His widow would write to Shoup in 1950, thanking him for the honorable treatment of her husband's remains. The smell of death persisted for months. Marines stationed on Betio after the battle reported that the coral sand would bubble with decomposition gases. Bodies buried too shallow working their way to the surface. Rain would wash bones from the soil, skulls appearing in erosion channels, finger bones scattered like coral fragments. The island's rat population exploded, feeding on remains the burial parties missed. Flies were so numerous they formed clouds, had to be controlled with DDT spraying that killed everything, turning Betio into a sterile wasteland that would take years to recover. The strategic value of Tarawa was debated immediately and continues today. The airfield on Betio never became the major base planners envisioned. B-24 bombers flew a few missions from it, but the Marshall Islands, invaded 2 months later, provided better airfields closer to Japan. Critics called Tarawa unnecessary, a waste of lives for marginal gain. Defenders argued it taught vital lessons about amphibious assault that saved lives in later operations. Both were probably right. Tarawa was simultaneously a necessary learning experience and a catastrophic failure of intelligence and planning. The reef at Tarawa changed everything. After-action reports focused obsessively on the unexpected shallow water, the failure of tide predictions, the need for more tracked vehicles. Every subsequent Pacific invasion would include hundreds of LVTs, enough to carry entire divisions over reefs. The Navy developed new landing craft, the LVT A-4 with 75mm howitzers, turning amphibious tractors into floating tanks. They brought in underwater demolition teams, frogmen who would scout reefs and clear obstacles. They improved naval gunfire, developed new ammunition types, trained liaison officers to coordinate support. Every lesson written in blood at Tarawa was applied to future operations. The Marines who survived Tarawa were changed forever. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who would later fight at Peleliu and Okinawa, met Tarawa veterans on Pavuvu and wrote, "They had a peculiar stare, what we called the 1,000-yard stare. They looked right through you like they were seeing something else, something we couldn't see. They didn't talk about Tarawa except with each other, and then only in short, cryptic references. Remember the reef? Remember the seawall? That was all. The rest of us learned not to ask questions." Private Robert Sherrod, the Time correspondent who'd ridden LVT number 10 across the reef, published his account of Tarawa in 1944. His description of Marines using bodies as stepping stones, of the reef running red with blood, of Japanese soldiers burning alive in pillboxes, shocked American readers accustomed to sanitized war reporting. Letters to Time called him unpatriotic, accused him of demoralizing the home front. Sherrod responded, "The Marines on Tarawa deserve to have their story told truthfully. They didn't die for propaganda. They died for each other, and the least we can do is record honestly how they died." Captain William Jones, recovered from his wounds, was asked by a reporter what Tarawa taught him about war. Jones thought for a long moment, then said, "I learned that the reef doesn't care about courage or cowardice, doesn't distinguish between American and Japanese. It just holds you there while the machine guns find you. I learned that brave men die as easily as cowards, that there's no glory in burning alive in a pillbox, that the only victory is surviving. I saw Marines walk across that reef knowing they would die, walking anyway because that's what Marines do. I saw the reef trap 1,000 Marines, and I saw those Marines keep walking. That's all I learned. That's everything I learned." The last survivor of the Tarawa garrison died in 2009, a Korean laborer named Park Sung-jo who'd been 17 when conscripted, 19 when captured, 94 when he died in Seoul. In his final interview, he remembered the reef. "The Americans came across the water, walking through their own dead. We shot them, but they kept coming. The water turned red, then pink, then red again. The reef held them for us, gave us perfect targets, but still they came. I knew then Japan would lose the war. Any nation that could absorb such losses and keep attacking would never surrender. The reef at Tarawa didn't stop the Americans. It just made them angry. The physical evidence of the battle remains on Betio. Construction projects regularly uncover unexploded ordnance, human remains, artifacts of combat. In 2015, a mass grave was discovered containing 35 Marines, identified through DNA analysis, returned to the United States for burial. More remain in the coral sand, unknown, unmarked part of the island now. Tourists visit the Japanese command bunker, take photographs of rusted landing craft on the reef, buy souvenirs made from shell casings. The island has been rebuilt, inhabited again, life covering the scars of war. But at low tide, when the reef emerges from the Pacific, locals say you can still see the dark stains in the coral where the blood soaked deepest, permanent shadows marking where 1,000 Marines discovered that the 500 yards from reef to beach would be the longest journey of their lives. When veterans returned to Betio for the 50th anniversary in 1993, many broke down at their first sight of the reef. One Marine, who'd lost his entire squad in the water, waded out to where he thought they'd died, stood there for an hour, water lapping at his knees, talking to ghosts only he could see. Another veteran brought a bottle of bourbon, poured it into the lagoon, a toast to friends who never left the reef. A Japanese veteran, one of the 17 who surrendered, came too. He and a Marine who'd fought at the seawall stood together in silence, old enemies who understood each other better than anyone who hadn't been there could understand either of them. The reef at Tarawa still determines the island's geography, its economy based on fishing and tourism, its culture shaped by the barrier that both protects and isolates. Children play where Marines died, fishermen cast nets where landing craft burned, families picnic where pillboxes stood. The reef that trapped 1,000 Marines on November 20, 1943, continues its ancient work of building and breaking, creating and destroying, indifferent to the human drama that briefly made it the most important geographic feature in the Pacific War. High tide covers it completely, hiding its jagged spine beneath peaceful waters. Low tide reveals it again, exposed and waiting, a fossilized reminder that nature's obstacles are often more deadly than any human enemy. This is the legacy of Tarawa, the knowledge that the reef would be there in every subsequent invasion, different in detail but identical in effect, holding landing craft, exposing men to fire, turning salt water into a killing field. Every Marine who hit a beach after Tarawa knew about the reef, had heard the stories, seen the photographs, understood that the distance from landing craft to beach might be measured in yards but would be paid for in lives. The reef at Tarawa entered Marine Corps institutional memory as a synonym for the unexpected obstacle that turns victory into massacre, the natural barrier that multiplies human violence, the geographic feature that can trap 1,000 Marines and turn the Pacific pink with their blood. When I saw the reef trap 1,000 Marines on November 20, 1943, I understood that some obstacles exist not to be overcome but to be endured, that some victories are indistinguishable from defeats except in the final count of who holds the ground when the shooting stops. The reef at Tarawa didn't choose sides, didn't care about causes, didn't distinguish between American and Japanese, brave and cowardly, young and old. It simply existed, a fact of geography that became a fact of history. A coral barrier that turned a 2-mile island into a 3-day battle that killed 6,000 men and changed amphibious warfare forever. The Marines who crossed that reef, wading through machine gun fire and their own dead, proved that determination can overcome even nature's obstacles, but only at a price that makes victory and tragedy synonymous. When I saw the reef trap 1,000 Marines, I saw the true face of war, not glory or honor but simple endurance. The ability to keep walking when every step might be your last, to advance through horror because the alternative is to let your brothers die alone. That's what the reef at Tarawa taught, written in blood across 500 yards of coral and sand. A lesson that echoes every time Marines hit a beach and wonder what unexpected barrier waits between them and their objective.